And we're live. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Changing things up a little bit and we'll see if it becomes a series or not, but I'm just going to call it a bookish ramble for now, where I pick a topic and I invite other bookish people to come and chat about it with me. And, you can join in the chat in the comments and stuff. But it's going to be like not as structured as the stuff I normally do. Like it's going to be a lot more free flowing. So, the topic of today's live is folklore, oral storytelling. What is it? Why do we love it? What do we think of it? And I'm joined today by the wonderful Tammy of Tammy Tries to Read. You want to introduce yourself to the viewers?
Sorry?
You want to introduce yourself?
Oh, yeah, sure. My name is Tammy from the channel Tammy Tries to Read. I mostly read fantasy, but I feel like I've been branching out recently. So, diversifying my portfolio, as it were.
Nice. What have you been branching out into?
More literary fiction this year, I'd say.
Oh, okay.
I think usually my repertoire is mostly fantasy, and then I do a couple of like romances or thrillers in between, but that's kind of like it. But this year I've read a lot more literary than in previous years.
Nice. No, my readings stay pretty much the same. It's sci-fi and fantasy. Very heavy on the fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's not. Yeah, I need to go anywhere.
I need to get into sci-fi. Like that's really one where I'm like, I feel like I would like sci-fi, but I don't really read a lot of sci-fi.
I get that. I don't know. I tried to read more of it, and I think it's one of those things where I like the idea of being a sci-fi person more than I actually am a sci-fi person. So I think I'm just gonna leave that where it is. Same with horror.
I get that. I'm like that with horror because I'm like, I want to be a horror girly. And then I read a horror and I'm like, I don't think I am.
So in terms of the topic today of folklore, and I have to turn off my phone because it is going to give me weird notifications. Because it's a new phone. I don't really know how it works. Like it was a whole ordeal to figure out how to turn it off without having to use the voice assistant. So a learning curve because I haven't replaced my phone in 6 years.
No, that's fair.
So how are you introduced to folklore?
For me, I think aside from obviously in school we learned a little bit here and there, but I think for me the first thing was actually the Journey to the West TV show. Which I think was in either 95 or 96. And when I was a kid, just for context, I didn't grow up with English speaking television, even though I grew up in North America. My parents just did not believe in TV. They were corrupts the mind, the English language or something. I don't even know. So at home, I never spoke English. And so we only watched Chinese television. And my parents had these recorded VHSs of, I'm really dating myself, but recorded VHSs of these Chinese TV shows from Hong Kong. And Journey to the West was one of the big ones and one of the main ones that I watched. And I watched it over and over and over again. It was my favorite thing. And that was probably the first thing that I really consciously clocked is oh, this is mythology and folklore, Probably just because it was so absurd.
Yeah. Is this one with real people or you said it was a cartoon?
No, it's a live action.
I was looking it up and I was like, is this the one?
It probably is. If it looks like really bad CGI and costuming, that's the one.
I'm going to share the screen so you can verify.
It's the creepy looking, really poorly put on nose for, I don't know any of their English names or even their Mandarin names. And then there's just the really bad wigs for the monkey hair. Oh, it was definitely a time.
Is it this? Is it showing up?
Not yet. It's still loading. Oh, that's the one. That's the one. That's my childhood right there, y'all.
I'm going to throw the link for the wiki in the comment section. I might have to return.
It's definitely a vibe. I feel like the thing is, though, C-dramas have not advanced much farther than this in the last, like, 30 years.
Solid.
CGI in C-drama land is really an acquired taste, if you will.
Yeah, I feel like I talked to you a little bit about my difficulties getting into the Untamed.
The Untamed. Yeah. Oh, the Untamed is especially the first episode, it's bad.
First episode was bad. I feel like once you get over the first episode, you're like, okay, I can handle this.
Did you end up finishing it in the end?
Yeah, I did finish it. I liked it a lot. Okay. I had to watch the cartoon first because that made
the first couple episodes are rough, to say the least.
Yeah. So I guess for me, I probably started Folklore like in school, and like it was interesting for me because I think it was like purely like a academic like thing. Like I'd only ever like read it, or like I think there are a lot of like picture book adaptations of stuff, like a single story, and they'd have like all the illustrations and whatnot. So I think I read a good amount of those, but like I don't think it was something I really grew up with, and I don't know how common it is in my family. Like I had because it's something that's come up in interviews, like folklore influencing like authors' writing and like you know their personal relationship with it. And so I was like, oh, like my parents didn't really tell me any that I remember. So I like asked my grandma, and she, maybe it's, I feel like also the thing with like asking older people, sometimes like, are you asking the right question?
Yeah.
Too. So because like when I asked her, she's like, we just read that in school, like no one told it to me. But I'm like, but I thought you're like from an area where that was like kind of like a little bit more popular, and like in the time frame I would have expected it, but
yeah. And I feel like for me with my parents, it's like sometimes they would just interject little tidbits of like folklore that they knew or whatever. But like as a child, like I never clocked that as folklore. Like for example, so like again, obviously I'm Chinese, so like it's all about Chinese folklore for me, like growing up. But like for Mid-Autumn Festival, for example, there's a lot of mythology and like folklore and legends around that, especially around Chang'e and Hou Yi. That's like the main kind of like couple. But then also there's a lot of like legends around the mooncake and like why we eat mooncakes at Mid-Autumn Festival. And my parents would like give random like stories, but like every year they would give a different one. And I'm like, you know, but so like what is happening? And also there was actually a TV show that I did used to watch. It was like, I can't remember what it's called now, but it was like an animated TV show with like a little Siamese cat living in a Chinese palace.
Was it on PBS?
That's the one.
Sagwa, the Siamese Chinese cat.
Yeah. And they actually did a Mid-Autumn Festival episode too, where they did one of the stories, which was different to all the ones my parents told as well. And so like it's just stuff like that where like as a kid I would never not acknowledge, but I would never like understand that particular tidbit of like information as folklore. But now as an adult, I'm like, oh yeah, that is like part of the mythology, you know, that's part of the cultural landscape that is like Chinese folklore.
I tried to put the link in, and I realized I put in like a Google search link, and it won't let me delete the comment. It's like, do you want to block this user or put them in timeout? Like, no, please don't do that.
I'm dead.
There we go. Hopefully that'll help people if they want to find it. I remember that. I feel like they like oversold me on certain foods though. Like, you know, you like watch like shows about a food and you finally have the food and you're like, this is not what you said it was gonna be.
What I love about Sagwa, this is so off topic, but Sagwa she used to write
it was a tale
with her tail, and I was like, this is amazing. And I used to learn Chinese calligraphy because I loved it so much, and I was like, I want to be this cat.
That's cute. Did you have like a pen with like a tail or something at the end of it?
No, I just had like a really big calligraphy brush. Chinese calligraphy, can't recommend. It's not a fun time. Okay. Like it is an art, and like you have to be very dedicated to the art, but otherwise it's rough. Because like it's an art form, so it's like the posture is really important. You have to basically like not squat, but like be in like it's very tiring because you have to like not be standing or sitting. You're just kind of like semi squatting in like a really wide stance, and you're just like, I don't know. Apparently, it contributes to the writing itself, and I'm like, I'm just tired. I'm not fit enough for this.
No, I don't think I ever got into calligraphy. Like I did like some, but like it was never good. Like I was never like committed to it.
I took weekly lessons.
As a scholar. Like
Ironically, with my hairdresser, who like in Canada is a hairdresser, but in China is like a really like big time calligrapher. So yeah, multi-talented people.
good for them.
Yeah.
Like what did you like about the folklore that you picked up from your parents or that you liked on the show? Like what
I
drew you to it?
I think fundamentally, I just like stories, like in general. And I think obviously we're both readers. Like I just like stories. And so when my parents told me like even a tidbit of a story, I would get really excited because my parents weren't the type to like read books to me or anything like that. And then with Journey to the West really was my favorite, but like I think it was just that the like magicalness of it because like this is like monkey dude walking around flying around with his stick that like grows and like can hit people, and then there's like this guy who looks like a pig, and then like they're just off on their adventures, and it's just like it's just for me it was like such a magical time, you know. And that genre of like Chinese dramas also became my favorite, that like mythology, like fantasy, historical fantasy, if you will.
I think for me, I like that folklore was so like simple but complex. Like you got like a really short story, but there's just like so much stuff going on in the story. Like I think I read like a lot of morality tales, like a lot of like, oh, you know, like the good little girl with like the abusive stepmom like goes off and she gets like some wishes or like a gift or something like that.
Yeah.
She's just such a good little girl. And then, you know, the bad stepsister's like, I'm gonna do the same thing, but like she's mean, so it's like a curse or something like that. So I like stuff like that, and also like specifically Grimm's fairy tales. Like I had watched like, the Disney versions of stuff first, and so then I went and read the originals. I was like,
they're dark. I remember the first time I read, I think it was Beauty and the Beast, like the original one, and I was like, this is dark.
What was different about the original? I don't think I actually went back and read that one. That one was French, right?
I actually don't remember the details of it, but I remember reading it. And I was like, this is not what I signed up for.
No, I remember for me it was specifically Cinderella. That's just like burned in my head.
Where she like, chops off her like toes and her ankle
so, like,
and her heel or whatever.
Yeah, there's all this like mutilation for the stepsister trying to fit into the shoe. And then they finally have like the wedding or whatever, Cinderella and the prince, and like the step family is invited. And like there's the two sisters, right? So the one of them, they're like in the carriage, and Cinderella's got her little animal army. And one of them's in the carriage, and the birds come and just like peck and scratch at her until she's blind. And she's like, oh gosh, this hurts. Can we switch places to her sister? Her sister switched places with her. Like, I was like, this is wild.
It really is. And the other one that I remember was also The Little Mermaid, which obviously isn't Grimm's fairy tale, but another one that was like Disney made it seem all like, you know, fun, good times. And then the actual one is like she just disappears. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, okay.
And so I've been talking a lot about like Grimm's and stuff like that. But I feel like in terms of like African American folklore, that was like a little bit more recent for me. Like I think there was like the Anansi series that was like kind of a popular like picture book series when I was a kid. But in terms of like me like going back and like reading stuff more intentionally, that's been like very recent. Like reading like Virginia Hamilton has a few collections. Zora Neale Hurston. Virginia Hamilton wrote for like kids. Zora Neale Hurston did like some more original work for adults. Like of her actually going out and getting the stories, and stuff like that. And it's also like very intriguing from like a historical standpoint because like obviously the stuff I read as a kid was like selected for children. So like I mean like there's sex jokes and stuff in there too, but also just like things that were like a product of like the time. Like I remember there was one story that was like an explanation for slavery basically that was like really sad.
Oh wow.
basically it was like there's like two packages on the road, and like there's like a white man and a black man, and God was like, pick your package, and the
Mhm.
black person picked the bigger package, and it was like a hoe and like farm tools, and like the white person got the smaller package, and that was like a pen and stuff like that. I was like, this is
Mhm.
like really sad. Because like there's some things that like push back against like slavery and like the conditions at the time. There's some things where it was like it seemed like
Mhm.
whoever was telling the story, still believed it.
Mhm.
I'm just reading through the comments.
Yeah.
Sarah also pointed out that for Arabic folklore, a lot is also rooted in religion.
Mhm.
I don't know if that's a common theme in the folklore that you were reading as well.
Honestly, I don't know. I know Journey to the West like is very much tied in with like Buddhism, I want to say, but I also don't know because my family is also not like Buddhist or Taoist or any of the kind of like more prominent religions in China. Like historically, my parents are Catholic. so actually interestingly, I was thinking like when I was a kid, also the other thing that I remember reading with like a similar vibe, which is sacrilegious to say, but like the Bible. And like certain stories in the Bible, there's certain stories where you're like, oh, there's like this story, or what are they called, parables, or like whatever, that I feel like are kind of I now as a non-Catholic now, I'm like, those are folklore. It's mythology.
It's funny because I had an author interview I feel like it was a few weeks ago at this point with her name was Marika Bailey. She was talking about like reading the Bible as a young kid and be like, oh, this is juicy.
It's
the scandal.
It's very scandalous.
I watched VeggieTales pretty much only as a kid and only read the kids' version of the Bible. So I was like, this is news to me. There's David and Goliath. There's that lady who got turned to a pillar of salt, and that's about it. It's like all I know.
I feel like there's a lot of like certain like stories in the Bible that you can that like the kids Bibles in particular pick and choose them out so that they're like lessons. There's a lesson to be learned here, you know, whatever. Like the Good Samaritan or whatever. But yeah, now as an adult looking back, I'm like, I put that in the folklore category.
Comments, not real, but Tales from the Hood is probably interested specifically Black lore. I still haven't seen that because I thought there's like 3 of them. Alicia says, trying to find Italian folklore and haven't been having much luck. Kind of surprised.
I
don't know any either, but I also just figured it was I wasn't looking.
Yeah, same.
I'm trying. Okay, what do you like about folklore? Do I have anything else I like about folklore? I don't know. I feel like it's also like fun to tell like back to people because it's so easy to put your own spin on it. It's like a short little story.
Yeah, exactly. And I also like something I like about in particular, maybe this is a question later on, but like how folklore is woven into kind of more modern novels. The way I like it is that like I like kind of the atmosphere that it adds. Like it always adds a layer of kind of like it's often told in like story in a story kind of format, which is something I really enjoy. And so like for me now, why I gravitate towards novels that feature folklore, I think that has a lot to do with it as well. Like the way that authors are incorporating them into their texts. I think I really like that aspect as well.
And there was a follow-up question. Oh, do you have a favorite folktale?
It's gonna be Journey to the West. I'm sorry to like beat a dead horse, but Journey to the West, I've never read the original text to be fair, and I don't think I ever will. Like I have an abridged version that I own that I want to read. But I just love it. I think it's also the nostalgia for me because like it is just something that I grew up on. I was like so obsessed with it because also there was that first one that you saw and then there was also a sequel series. Okay. There's a sequel series that came out a couple of years later. And I think that it's just like something that has been in my life for so long. I've also watched animated versions. I've read kind of comic adaptations and I just really like it. And now I read anytime I see like the Monkey King on like a synopsis, if it's incorporated into a story in any way, shape, or form, I'm like auto buy immediately. Like it's not a question for me. It's so good. It's so good.
Like, because I thought the Monkey King, it was kind of like, I forget how it was structured in the book, but I thought there was kind of like little like episodes, like, oh, like this is kind of like an arc. This is another arc. You got like a favorite arc, I guess, from the Monkey King?
I think for me, I really like the arc where he gets basically like banished, not banished, but he gets like sent under the mountain and then he has to like escape. That's like my favorite part of the story. And I think it's like part of it is like because it's that underdog story, right? Like he's kind of like this rascal and like the gods have like punished him and now like, you just really want him to break free of this mountain. And like that is just like I just love that moment when he breaks free, especially in the TV show. It's done so poorly, like the CGI for when the mountain breaks apart. It's just like it's so vividly like ingrained in me.
What was that? I know there's a movie series that Netflix had up for a little bit. It wasn't produced by Netflix, but like they were just it was up, and so that's how I found it. And I remember I think the one that they had up was like from him breaking out to like the I forget where it ended. Like I think it was like Tripitaka was like in trouble or something like that, and Monkey King had to get him back.
I don't know if I watched them on Netflix. I know Netflix at some point had the Journey to the West, but with like all the white people.
I didn't watch that one.
I was like, my favorite thing that came out of that was like I think I saw a tweet or someone said it's like if they traveled further west, they would be in the east.
I had not seen that one.
It was so good. It was so good. I was like, there's no way I'm watching this.
Yeah. But the movie I think was fun for me because, like, I mean, it didn't look super believable. But I was like, it's like watching a play. Like, you're not supposed to be like, oh wow, this is so lifelike. Yeah. It's like, oh, this is like gesturing at something.
Yeah. I need to see if that's still on there and check that out.
I feel like they took it off because I was really annoyed when I found out my library had it, and so I was like, okay. That's a relief.
Mm-hmm. What about you? What's your favorite?
I forgot to say I was gonna circle back. Something also really liked was like how funny a lot of folktales are. Like I had this I used to be reading the collections like on the like train to work, and I had like this big it's like this thick, like this big, like looks like a kid's book. I used to like in the flipping through it like laughing to myself the whole time. Like I probably look like such a weirdo, but I was like, this is like comedy gold. Like I really like the sense of humor, I think, in a lot of folktales, especially with like trickster characters. So like I feel like one that like is easiest for me to like remember is like the Tale of the Black Snake. This is like an African American one where so again it's a little grim because it's like basically a slave had seen like this like black snake, and the snake said something to him. He's like, oh, a talking snake. Like, if I like tell like my master about you, like maybe I can get free or I can like sell you or something. The snake's like, I'd really appreciate if you just like left me alone and like didn't tell anyone that I talked to you. And so he's like, I'm gonna do it anyway. So he comes back with the master in tow, and like the snake's obviously just like, I'm not talking, so I asked you not to bring this guy here. And the slave gets in trouble, and then master leaves, and the snake's like, oh, thank God that guy is gone. And the slave was like really upset. He's like, I could have gotten money. Like I could have gotten so much out of you. And the snake's like, you're just like, you're fake. Like we're both black. Like where's the solidarity? And to me, it was just funny. So it was just so like absurd that like the snake is like, we are one and the same. You and I, we are brothers. I was expecting loyalty from you. Like I did a really bad job retelling it. But a really, really bad job retelling it. But like in the story, you kind of see the snake's logic, but you're like, yes, but no.
But no.
No. I feel like there's a lot of variations of that story too, where like the magic object does something magical, and they're like, you can't tell anyone. And someone brings someone, and they're like, I'm not doing the magic anymore. They lost out. So that was one. And I feel like I have to pick a second. I like a lot of Brer Rabbit stories, honestly, because he's always up to something. He's always like scheming and plotting. I'm trying to think of like my favorite trick that he pulled. I can't think of one. It's bad. All of a sudden, I can't remember a single folktale besides the snake.
This is me. This is also me. I'm like, no thoughts, head empty.
I'm do I have another one? I feel like there's just like some that were kind of like just like strange. Like I think my second one, just because it was like kind of like a real event, like a tall tale type thing, was like there was this
Mhm.
town where they said they found a mermaid in a bottle. This was like
Mhm.
somewhere in Charleston, I think. Um, and there was like the mermaid in the bottle was being kept in like an apothecary's house, and they were like people were like coming and paying to see it and stuff. But then shortly after, this mermaid in a bottle showed up, like it stopped raining, like they had this really bad drought. And they're like, the mermaid in the bottle is like, she's in prison, like she's stopping the
Mhm.
rain. You have to let her out. And so they like raided the house and like broke the bottle and let her out. And there was like a big flood afterwards. And I think there was like an actual like historical event that's like tied to around that time. So I think that one
Okay.
was like interesting to me because it was like almost like a tall tale, and that there's like actual like a
Mhm.
grain of something there.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I feel like that's one
That's
that I can think
interesting.
of most readily.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Do you have like a favorite piece of like folklore history or trivia, like more about like, the folklore tradition or like people who told the stories themselves?
I don't think I do, to be honest. The only thing I can think of is like, so like in Chinese literature, the kind of four classics are, I don't know, like Chinese literature, like classic Chinese literature is like very weird in that like a lot of it is like part history, part mythology,
Mm.
part fiction. And then like it's just and it's all kind of just like very canonical to kind of like the culture. And so my favorite, maybe it's not a folklore, but there is one called the water margin, I think it's called. Um, but anyway, this is kind of off topic because it's not really, that one's like less folklore because it's more of like just like a straight up like wuxia.
Mm.
Um, but that one, someone later on, still very, very long time ago, wrote a erotica fanfic of this book and is also now considered a Chinese classic, which I just think is just like Chinese classics are so unserious, like that this is one of the great Chinese classics. It's like if someone told you 50 Shades of Grey was an American classic, like you know, that's kind of the modern day equivalent.
I don't know, man. Journey to the West is pretty.
Journey to the West is also quite pretty wild.
Yeah, because like my favorite story from that one, I think, is like in the beginning, like it was like what was it when he was talking to Buddha and he didn't believe it was Buddha? So what is it? He's talking to the Monkey King's talking to Buddha. Buddha's like, I'm Buddha. Monkey King's like, no, you're not.
Yeah,
He's
yeah.
like,
He's like,
I can prove it. I'm like the whole world. Like, run as far as you can and tell me what you see. Monkey King's like runs as far as he can. And he takes his shit. And I think he also like this is there as well. So he's like, this isn't serious. Like, whatever. And he comes back to the guy and is like, you're not Buddha. Like, I went to the edge of the
yeah.
world. I didn't see you there. And the guy's like, bro, like, look at my hand. And the Monkey King, like, basically just used the bathroom on Buddha's hand. And he's like, oh, well,
Sorry.
maybe you are Buddha after all.
Yeah, Chinese classics are very not serious at all.
Okay, sorry, one
Yeah.
second.
Yeah.
Just responding to a message. For people who didn't know, Kiki was supposed to be here and she might be able to join.
Oh, nice.
But I mean, I kind of didn't really touch on this with the African American folktales and stuff, but like I feel like it's also like very bittersweet because a lot of them are
Mm.
from like the times of slavery. Like you can find stuff, like from Africa, like pre colonialism. But if we're talking African American stuff, a lot of the early stuff is definitely still very much tied in with slavery. So there's always kind of
Right.
like that cast over all the stories.
Mm-hmm.
Was there anything else I wanted to say? I was also surprised at how much like God and the devil showed up in the stories because it just felt so
Oh,
sacrilegious to me. There'd be like a lot of stories of like God like talking to people, not necessarily doing miracles or like people like talking to the devil, and like sometimes they beat the devil and sometimes the devil's kind of like helping them out with stuff. I was like, I
Oh.
feel like am I allowed to read this? I don't know. I don't know why. I was like, there's something in my head. I was like, I was not expecting this at all.
That's really interesting.
So I guess in terms of just like listening to stories, do you see a difference between like listening to an audiobook and listening to folktales? Like have anyone like you said your parents told you stuff.
Yeah, a little bit, but like to be honest, again, like my main exposure to kind of like especially Chinese mythology is really television. So like for
Mm,
me, it was very much tied with like the visual medium as well. Very much TV shows. If you're ever
mm,
interested in Chinese mythology, old school TVB is like Hong Kong's like only television broadcast network. And so they used to produce like all of the TV shows in Hong Kong, and so they do a lot of like historical fantasies that are based on mythologies. So I just grew up watching those, and
mm,
so that was my main exposure. So like if I think about reading it versus like audiobook, it's hard to say because I would say neither for me
mm,
personally. Though I did have these like I don't even remember what they're called, and I don't own them anymore. But I had these 2 volumes of Japanese folk tales actually that I
mm.
read as a kid that were strange, like shockingly considering these were like a collection for children. They were shockingly depressing. Like some of them were fun, but then some of them I was like, this is sad.
Yeah. It's interesting, from like a historical perspective, like the idea of like folktales being a
Mm,
children's thing, because historically that just hasn't always been the case. Like,
yeah, that's
um,
true.
at least like for the like again, I was reading the African American folktales, and like the one I read was
Mm-hmm.
like kind of like a scholar like annotated edition. Like they'd be like, okay, here's some of like the historical
Mm,
like here's who was like in terms of supporting it, and like we need to collect this stuff, and also people are like, no, like this is a shameful part of our history, we don't want it around, like
right.
kind of internal conversations among African Americans. Like even the people who wanted to collect it had very different reasons for why they wanted to collect it and where they saw folklore in like African American culture going forward. So that was like very
Mhm.
interesting. But yeah, like I mean, they weren't they were not for kids,
Yeah.
and like I think for the stories in general, like with African American stuff, there was kind of like it became like a kids thing again, tied with like slavery and like, having like an enslaved like nurse or caretaker, or even like
Right.
post emancipation, like a hired person who was like
Mhm.
telling these stories to like young white kids to help them pass the time. And like that kind of also being like a thread in terms of how African American folktales kind of became like a kids thing, like how we get like Song of the
Right.
South and Disney and stuff like that.
Right.
Hey Kiki, thanks for coming.
I'm so sorry. Hello, Tammy. I don't know. I won't take up too much time by apologizing, but I'm very sorry for being late. I don't
You're fine.
and you'll
You
get
want to
this.
introduce
Hello.
yourself to the viewers real quick?
Oh, sure. I am the very late Kiki, otherwise known as Aquila. I bookstagram at If This Is Paradise. I'm from and live in Jamaica, and all of our literature is influenced by folklore, so I thought that this would be a great discussion. Despite my tardiness, I was genuinely interested. So here I am. Yeah.
So we had covered a few things, but you want to give us a speed run on like how you got introduced to folklore, what you like about it? Like, do you have like a favorite folktale?
Okay, how I got introduced to folklore. It's kind of hard for me to pinpoint an exact moment in time. I think generally speaking in our school in terms of a lot of the poetry that we were introduced to, I think some of the stories that were in the primary reading book would sometimes like have those kind of elements. Oh, but a definitive moment was, I wish I had the book here. And I remember many things by a Bayesian writer that was published by a local publishing company. And it had a lot of different folk tales from across the Caribbean region. And I think that was probably the first sort of definitive moment where I could like identify things that were presented to me as folklore, because it had a story about one particular figure called the rolling calf. And I knew about the rolling calf being Jamaican. That's probably one of our most prominent ones. So that was probably my defining moment. But otherwise, I think it was just, I just heard stories, usually in an institutional environment. I think, unlike a lot of other persons who, when they talk, they say like when they went to country and they visited like their grandparents, or if they lived in country and like persons would be talking about it like that. I would not say that's my experience. So a favorite one, I like the Sukuyan or the Old Hague or Old Hague. I'm never quite sure how to pronounce it. I think it's Old Hague, which is pretty popular across the Americas, I think, in different with different names. And I'm really attached to her. And I really appreciate when authors write about her in a way that doesn't present her as an obstacle or a villain. And I'm thinking in particular, No Gods, No Monsters that I'm reading right now with the group by Cadwell Turnbull has a Sukiyant figure who's like that. And also Root Magic by Eden Royce, which has a very oops, I hope that's not a spoiler. Anyway, but I really that was also like a really favorite one. I wasn't expecting it. And I was very grateful for it because not too long ago I had read a book where it was a Mama Waters character, and she was presented as a kind of obstacle to the protagonist journey, even though you could tell that the author liked the Mama Waters figure, but for whatever reason, she still kind of went on a more conventional path. So yeah, that's me.
I guess we kind of touched on it a little bit. But do you want to, this wasn't a planned question. Do people have like things or thoughts on like maybe complicated experiences with folklore? Like I kind of touched on like, oh, as I was getting more into like formally reading African American folklore, because it wasn't something I really grew up with. Like I think it's really funny, like the things that I like laugh out loud at, but there's also things where it's kind of like, oh, this is sad, like this is someone like kind of parroting like the racist ideas of the time, or like even just like telling the stories. I'm like, oh, like a lot of these stories are set during slavery, so there's like dynamics here that are very much not funny, but like there is sort of something. My takeaway was like the joke, like the humor in spite of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess you kind of touched on some of it, Kiki, in your spot, but I didn't know if either of you wanted to like share about that, or maybe you don't have a complicated view of folklore.
I don't know if Tammy wants to go first since I just spoke.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I think with me, actually, it wasn't with Caribbean folklore so much, or well, it was in a Nigerian novel I read by, it's called Black Sunday by Tola Ratimi Abraham. I hope I got her name right. And it's literary fiction, but of course, like with a lot of our stories, you know, we blend all kind of forms. I mean, literary fiction is just like a US marketplace term. And she had this parallel kind of narrative element going on where she compared a lot of biblical parables to, I think, were specifically Yoruba parables and like and folk stories and stuff, because religion and spirituality was a major theme in the novel. And what was really interesting there is that for someone in the diaspora, where when we tend to look back to West Africa in particular, it's always looking at it in a Wally sort of like positive way. Like we're looking at our African retentive practices and stories now, and we're looking back and we're like this is a good thing. It's good value, obviously, in response to our past. But I found that in her novel, she kind of really highlighted the problematic elements in a lot of their sayings and stories, and how they're actually kind of, some of them are rather damaging. or propagate like problematic ideas around, I think, specifically children and family relations, because that was also a major theme in the novel. And that was very new to me, because I think before I had always been told West African folklore stories, especially with Anansi, as like well, he's a trickster figure. So I guess he's also kind of morally ambiguous, but I think it was still presented in a with wally positive connotations. And this was the first time where I saw someone go, actually, there's some problematic stuff here that we need to look at again, and that it's not a kind of simple sort of like the indigenous culture is right and woolly good versus this colonial one that's like woolly bad. So that's my experience.
Do you have any thoughts, Tammy?
I don't have any very put together thoughts, but as I'm thinking about it, I definitely think, like, especially in like Chinese folklore, a lot of mythologies are heavily misogynistic. Like, there's a lot of mythological like creatures that are typically associated with like bad people that are always women. They're always women. Like, so in Chinese mythology, it's like the fox spirit is always like a woman who is like conniving, uses her sexual wily ways to lure pure innocent men into their demise. And I'm just like, I love her, like, you know, but like it's not traditionally presented in a positive way. Whereas I'm just like, eat them, just eat them all. Who cares? And then the other one's actually a snake spirits. Like, those are also typically women, also very much depicted usually as like very sexual. Like, men desire them, but that's what leads to their demise. And then on the converse, on the other side, sometimes you have like men who are always like dragon spirits, and it's always men because the dragon is the emperor in like Chinese culture. It's like the emperor, only the emperor can wear dragon paraphernalia. That is like a thing. Like, if you wear a dragon on your outfit, that's treason, and you'd be sentenced to death in the old times. So yeah, like it's just stuff like that where it's like, oh, like the highest beings are always like associated with the male form, and then on the other side, women are always very hypersexualized, very villainized. Yeah. As I think, unfortunately, the world still is.
Yeah. Picking up on that, I was thinking like the Mamiwata figure. Because I don't know how, well, I guess because she's kind of mixed with the idea of this siren, I guess, at least in terms of how she's written and spoken about in parts of the Caribbean. And I'm speaking specifically to more English speaking countries. I'm not quite sure what it would be like in like the French or the Dutch or the Spanish. But that was like the issue I had with the novel I had read, because she was presented as that like sexual siren, and she was coming in to like enchant all the men and the boys and like manipulate them. And I was just like, no. Why are we still doing this, and why is this in a middle grade novel? I don't like. So and you could tell that the author liked her. So I guess these are some of the elements that are still sort of really embedded in the stories. It's also true for the Sukiya as well. Not so, I think in some versions, like with Cadwell Turnbull, when he wrote her in a short story, she was almost more like a vampire, because depending on the story, like they have different elements. So in this one, she was blood sucking. But in Sirius Blooms at Night, which is Shani Mutu's debut novel, she's a Trinidadian. Well, she's born in Ireland, raised in Trinidad and Tobago, lived most of her life in Canada now. And one of the characters, or the main character in the book, is a woman who ends up being isolated. And she works a lot with herbs and stuff. So she becomes like that lonely woman at the periphery and takes on these, you see through the story how the people in the village start to almost mythologize her as this kind of Sukiyant figure, and as a way to stigmatize her, like, oh, she's traveling through the sky and fire, and she'll attack you, and like as a scary person. And you see that a lot with Caribbean fiction writers. They heavily use like a lot of elements of our folklore and integrate it into their stories, or they kind of try and generate new ones. I'm thinking of These Ghosts Are Family by Maisie Card, where the last chapter is well known, where she kind of creates her own kind of folklore from the trauma that had preceded in the previous chapters, which was also kind of pulled from a kind of Sukiyama kind of vibe. So Old Hague. So yeah.
Are there like books that you feel really capture the feeling of folklore, like for you? I guess we have all different experiences because Tammy, you mentioned that. Like for you, it's really more visual stuff and like TV.
I was trying to think if anything was TV for me, but not so much. I also appreciated like that detailing, Tammy, on the dragon, because I'm reading a lot of Chinese webtoons and web novels, and like about the dragon thing, I was like, oh, like things are clicking now. So thanks, I appreciate that. Yeah, it's more print for us, I think, than visual, because we don't quite have that developed. We have films, and there are definitely films that employ it, but unless you're going to indie festivals and stuff like that, like distribution, they're hard to access. So I think for us, it's easiest for the writers to capture and convey our folklore than anyone else. I'm thinking of Nalo Hopkinson. She uses that a lot in her fiction. I'm thinking Midnight Robber, Brown Girl in the Ring, Falling in Love with Hominids. Gosh, there are so many. I think Shani Mutu again with Serious Poems at Night, Maisie Card with These Ghosts Are Family. You kind of have something like A Tall History of Sugar by Cordella Forbes, where she almost creates her own kind of folkloric figure. It's about Jamaica's colonial history in a way, but she makes these links with the sugar industry and, for example, diabetes in the local population and how that manifests. But she does it in a way that almost feels fable-like. That was really fascinating, and I think I find myself sort of most fascinated with the authors who kind of not just integrate the folklore but extend it in a way that's really generative. That's what comes to mind for now.
For me, the book that I feel like best captures kind of that TV show, like the historical Chinese fantasy folklore type of TV shows, is Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Su Lin Tan. I love that book, but specifically, I think it very much reads like one of those TV shows that I grew up on. Specifically, interestingly, because it is sort of an extension of the Chang'e and Hou legend, but it actually reminds me a lot of also. There's a legend. What's the English name? What would the English name be? It's like it would be like cow, boy, and like knitter girl, weaver girl. I think that's the title. It's like, but basically, China loves its star-crossed lovers. Like every romance in Chinese mythology is star-crossed lovers. But this particular one is about these two. They're both celestial beings, and she is more like a fairy type of celestial being. He is a cowboy, like he's literally like a cow. But they fall in love, but they are actually personifications of actual stars in the sky. I don't know which ones exactly. They end up being separated by the gods across what they call the Celestial River, but that's actually the Milky Way, like in the sky. So that's actually a story about them. But in particular, there's a TV show that was based on that legend and their romance, and Daughter of the Moon Goddess gives me those vibes in terms of just the way that it plays out, the kind of like high pace, high energy, like fast paced stories. And then I think someone who does take Chinese mythology, like old Chinese mythology, and takes a really interesting spin on them is Ken Liu. In his short story collection, The Paper Menagerie and Other Stories, there is in particular a story called, I think it's called Good Hunting. There's also an episode on a Netflix show that is based off this story, and it is about a fox spirit. And I think it's a really interesting take on the fox spirit. Like I said, typically speaking, the fox spirit in Chinese mythology is kind of like the wily female, you know? And I think that story does a really interesting, does a really good job at like tackling that mythology in a different light.
I think for me, I think of Redemption in Indigo by Karen Lord, because the voice to me, it's opens up with like someone telling you a story. I think the narrative voice is like really strong, and that to me, I don't know what it is, but with folk tales, I feel like even when they're in written form, like there's something about like the cadence to it that I feel like it's really hard to capture, and it's like very distinct. So I would say that, and also there was one short story by Craig Lawrence Gidney that Beneath the Briar Patch by Craig Lawrence Gidney, which was a take on the story of Brer Rabbit and Tar Baby, except it involves like mojo and like magic, and basically Brer Rabbit gets into more trouble than in the original story. Just putting stuff in the comments if people want to read or come back and reference it later.
For sure. I think, yeah, a lot of books that have that kind of like story in a story, I always feel like have the folktale vibes. I think the kind of two that come to my mind are that have that element, like a more like a narrator, that character is what's it called? Empress of Salt and Fortune by Nevo, my favorite book. I don't know why I blanked there.
I just read that. It was so good, and you're so right about how like the whole folklore vibe, like it was so good. Like wow, yes.
I think that book really captures it, and that one actually, bringing it back to when you were asking about the audiobook thing, that one on audio is phenomenal. I think it works so well as an audiobook. I mean, obviously, I like it physically. I've read the book like 6 times. It's a problem. But the other one is actually a song. What is it? A Song of Storms and Silence, which is the sequel to A Song of Race and Ruin. But interestingly, in the first book, they didn't have this element in the book. But in the second book, it's actually told. There's like interludes at kind of like the beginning, middle, and end, where there is actually like a narrator character speaking to you and telling you the story. So it's a very interesting progression from book 1 to book 2, in which book 1, it's kind of like just, you know, like a YA fantasy. You think you're just like reading their story. But then in book 2, it's almost like this person is like, oh yeah, I've actually been telling you this story the whole time. And I thought that was like a really interesting twist, and added this layer of like storytelling that I felt like book 1 didn't have, that I thought was like really, really, really well done.
So this one is like kind of a tangent, but I was wondering, does oral storytelling like influence how you create your reviews or like view your mode of reviewing? I can give some I'll let you guys go if someone wants to go, but I can give some context for why I even asked the question. So like for me, I was reading like the annotated African American folktales, and there's like a lot of talk in there about like, you know, the politics of the people who are either for like not preserving folklore or the people who want to preserve it, and like what their reasons were. And a lot of it was around like African American like image and like respect and like prestige and stuff like that. And I have always kind of, it's like a question I keep coming back to, like the idea of like civilization, like what is civilization, who defines it, and what are their goals in defining it? 'Cause I don't know if anyone else in school was taught like, oh, there's like the 5 things you need to have a civilization. One of them is like a written system of language. And it's kind of like how convenient for people with a written system of language who want to like steal and pillage to say that that's what makes people civilized, and anyone who doesn't have this isn't civilized. And so I just kind of had a weird moment where I was like, you know, just like in general, writing and literacy is like very important in the US where I live. And like, there is kind of like a primacy, I feel like, placed on in terms of like intellectual mediums. I don't know if that makes sense. And I was kind of like, does that affect how I feel about like my channel and how I review? That like I primarily do video mediums and it's a lot of stuff is live. It's like I have a script, but a lot of it's off the cuff. It's not like as condensed. It's definitely not like a written review. And so that's something I was kind of like thinking about, like, okay, like I could take like speaking and storytelling lessons to like get better at it is what I do, but does that like general assumption and like just how I like went through school like affect how I view my channel, like how I structure things or things like that. So I was just being nosy. I wanted to ask what people they thought.
I don't know if it influences me in general, although I do think in terms of the kind of review writing I do on my page, I wasn't so conscious of it before, but I'm getting more comfortable doing it now, which is to make it more personal and almost like I'm the storyteller of my book journey as opposed to doing it like a review, because there's definitely a certain template when you read like reviews in other platforms of how it's done. But there was one post I did recently when I reread Annie John by Jamaica Kincaid. And there was a scene in the book that involved the mother character leaving from Provision Ground, which is like the farming ground. And she had a snake on her head. I think, was this a story that she told her daughter? I think so. But she didn't know it was in the basket of food until she found out later. And it was like a dark kind of memory or story for her. And I remember having a kind of, because the snake was black and it just seemed kind of coded in a way where elements that I could have associated with something more African retentive is kind of coded as sort of in a more European Christian biblical way of like the evil snake and blah, 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 blah. And so I wrote a response on my page where I sort of fabulated something different. Like I kind of rewrote it. It was basically fan fiction, really. Whereas like I would prefer it to go this way. And I was inspired by an artwork by Brianna McCarthy, who is a Trinidad and Tobago artist, because she had this beautiful illustrated painting of a woman with a snake on her head and herbs coming out of her crown almost. And in a way, I felt like I was sort of recreating a different kind of story for this character that was queer, and I felt like more of this space than was in the novel. And I think I could, maybe if I stretch it, like I could, like for me, like that, I associate that with folklore telling because it's not just about preservation, it's about change. Because it has to change with us, and we preserve, but we also make new ones. So I think that was definitely because I don't read a ton of fan fiction. So what I would have been pulling from in terms of the story elements would have been something more like folklore and folk tales about those kind of woman figures and about snakes and about plants and about the night, that kind of thing. Yeah.
I think for me, less so in terms of like how oral storytelling influences the way that I structure my reviews. I think that it, and more broadly speaking, in recent years, like the last couple of years, I'd say I've definitely tried to be more conscious about different types of storytelling, not just oral storytelling, but different types of storytelling, especially if we're talking like outside of the Western canon, because I think there's a lot of times where you read a book and I have to think about, do I think this book is poorly paced or am I the problem, right? Like, am I just uneducated? You know what I'm saying? And so I think that's something that I, in particular, have really tried to think more critically about and be more conscious about. And oral storytelling definitely fits into that because I think a lot of non-Western cultures have a heavier focus on oral storytelling. And so I think that's something that I try to keep in mind now when I review books, to be a little bit more conscious about the way I speak about books that are not written by white people. if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. I read Craft in the Real World last year by Matthew Salasis. I did not check on the pronunciation before, so I apologize if I got that wrong. But he's a Korean American writer. He's gone through the MFA program. He's a novelist, and he wrote in that book basically exactly what Tammy was talking about how different like craft is culture. So this idea that there is this sort of abstract ideal, it's remote from everything that's like the standard, and then there's everything else, there's experimentation, there's this and that, is incorrect. Like there's no one standard. It's just different kinds of storytelling, and that the one that we're presented with is this sort of removed standard is very cultural and very rooted in a very specific place and time and politics. And he was pointing specifically to the influence of the CIA and government-funded literary programmings in the mid-20th century and how that's influenced the literary market in the U.S. to this day. And he was contrasting that with different storytelling kinds of traditions from different countries. So like a US critic, perhaps white critic, might read a book and go, oh, this is too melodramatic, that's bad. And he would point to, well, perhaps like in some Chinese stories or from different cultures, like the melodrama is it. Like that's the point, that's a feature, it's not a flaw. So you have to have like the cultural knowledge and context to then be able to even begin to address that, rather than to look at it as bad writing, right? So that was pretty, I would recommend that. Like it was a really fantastic read. Half of the book is sort of very practical exercises for writers, so I skipped that part. But the first half was more relevant for readers. I mean, I know a lot of readers are writers, so like go right ahead, but not me. The first half was really great, especially since I grew up in my teens. I got assigned African lit in school, primarily East and West African lit. And I noticed how differently the character development was. But I didn't know how to articulate it at the time. And I enjoyed it, but I think in my head, I still read it as wrong because it was so different from what I had been raised on, which was primarily British, with a bit of US lit. And it was reading his book where he really, he pulled on particular African critics who sort of delineated, like, we write differently and we do character differently, and it's influenced by these modes of storytelling. It's not that it's bad, it's just not how we do it. So, and he even expanded the sort of the notion of what's European storytelling too. So it's not even as one-dimensional as it's presented in terms of like this sort of wide, general white tradition. So it was really great for that. I recommend it.
That was all the questions I had for today. Was there anything anyone had they wanted to share, like last thoughts or recommendations or something? They're like, oh, I just now realized I haven't answered this question that I hadn't thought of to say before.
I don't think so. I don't have my list of like, because I kind of rushed on here. So I think I mentioned most of the books that I felt I wanted to highlight in terms of being influenced by or incorporating folklore. So I think we're good.
Okay. Well, thanks for joining me too. Thank you so much to everyone in the comments for coming out and watching. I hope you have a good rest of your day, and take care and goodbye. Bye.
Bye.